So, morning everyone. We can start in the interest of time. I do expect more people will filter in because of generally how late everyone's been in these sessions. My name is Gemma Robson. I'm the country representative for impact initiatives in Ukraine. If you've not heard of impact initiatives, you may have heard of our main initiative, the REACH initiative. We work in 30 countries odd globally to support evidence-based prioritization with data, analysis, capacity building activities, etc. We've been in Ukraine specifically, consistently since 2015, but obviously after February last year, had to rapidly scale up and change our area of focus to support the rapidly growing humanitarian system. I think this particular panel is very timely. 1 year on, obviously last month we had the anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I've attended a number of talks at this particular forum over the last day and a half, and I think Ukraine has come up in actually all of them. Sometimes deliberately, it was on the agenda, sometimes just because it's really, really high on most people's minds at the moment. And people are always talking in these mentions of Ukraine about the needs, right? What the needs that we're seeing in Ukraine, the relative severity of the needs in Ukraine. But very rarely is that then backed up with any statements of evidence, any data that shows what's actually happening in the country that you could use to form an accurate picture of how you should possibly respond. So that's what we're going to be doing today. Firstly, we're going to be taking a very, very brief look at the humanitarian conditions in Ukraine as demonstrated by the data. And this will be brief because this is not supposed to be a lecture, it's supposed to be a panel discussion. And then we'll move into the possibly more interesting portion, which is how that data is used to inform. So at a strategic level, how do you make decisions about the data? And at a programmatic level as well, how are you adjusting, how you're actually operating in the country to respond to needs as they change? So I've got panelists who are very awkwardly spread out across the room right now and also online, but I'm really, really excited to introduce you to them. So firstly, we have Nuna Waring, who is the head of research, assessments and monitoring for WFP in Ukraine. We have Liz Vickman, who is a program manager in the humanitarian data unit in CEDA. We have Anastasia Fitasova here, who is a research manager for impact initiatives in Ukraine. And I really hope that online, live from the British Embassy in Kyiv, we have Derek Newman, who's the lead humanitarian advisor for FCDO. So to start with them, we'll go straight into this 10 to 15 minute presentation. So Anastasia, please take it away.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm pleased to make this presentation on Ukraine's crisis 1 year on. It will be mostly based on data that we collected in REACH, which is one of the initiatives of impact. And I will start my presentation with the findings of one of the biggest and the most comprehensive assessments that was made by REACH in Ukraine in 2022, the multi-sector needs assessment. I will use this abbreviation MSNA during this presentation. So at this slide, you can see a screenshot from one of the outputs that we produce based on this data, MSNA bulletin, and I also integrated a QR code to this bulletin so you can access it directly through the screen and downloaded it. So yeah, and I also integrated several QR codes to the different our research that we did in 2022. So MSNA, it's a global approach that we in REACH use in different humanitarian contexts to understand the magnitude, so how many people are in need and severity of needs. And we use a 5-point rank scale from no need to extreme plus level of needs. We use this approach mostly to inform the humanitarian project cycle and to inform HNO and HRP processes. And in Ukraine, since October to December 2022, REACH Ukraine, together with WFP, conducted more than 13,000 of household interviews in 23 oblasts and 55 rayons. Rayon, it's admin 2 level, and the data is representative for admin 2 level. So, what is the data saying about the humanitarian needs in Ukraine? about the magnitude and about the severity. Overall, the majority of population in Ukraine have severe or extreme levels of needs. This is 77%. Half of them, like 42% of total, have extreme level of needs. And these needs are mostly driven by livelihoods and shelter and NFI. And also extreme level of needs are driven by protection very much. If you look at this map, you can see the areas colored in dark red along the front line or historic contact line, which are the areas with the highest proportion of people with with the extreme level of needs. You can also see areas on the north, which are also quite dark, and these are areas of return. One of the benefits of MSNA is that we are able to understand how many households have needs in more than one sector. Usually in humanitarian context, this percentage is quite higher, but here in Ukraine, the number of households who have needs in more than one sector is quite small, it's 13%. These households are mainly located in conflict-affected areas in the east and south, and the most common combinations of needs are, again, in livelihoods, shelter and NFI, or protection. Yep, extreme level of needs are also coupled with different vulnerabilities, and it will not be a surprise for you if I will say that people with disabilities, displaced, returnees, people with more than 3 children, older people, female-headed households are more likely to have extreme levels of needs. But I also want to pay your attention particularly to people with disabilities and displaced population, which are the most likely to have this extreme level of needs. And we also highlighted one chart at the end, which showed that people without household which do not have members with employment, with jobs, they are much higher, have probability to have extreme level of needs, 30 percentage points. Which is also confirmed the statement that livelihoods is very important sector that drives humanitarian needs in Ukraine. A Ukraine crisis, as we always hear in this event, is a displacement crisis. And in Reach, since May 2022, we conduct the collective site monitoring. We do it monthly, and in 2023 we already a bit changed the methodology. Now we do it bi-monthly, and we collect the data about the different places where people live, in shared spaces. For example, in educational facilities, like in kindergartens, in schools, in university dormitories, and in November. In parallel to the general MSNA, we conducted a household assessment of people who live in collective sites. And at this map, you see the areas where the proportions of people with extreme level of needs are much higher in terms of people who live in collective sites. And you see that these areas are not only on the east and south, but also in central Ukraine and on the western Ukraine. And the collective sites host about 3% of displaced population, according to the general population survey of IOM. But still, this population have quite severe needs, because 79% of households have such needs. And usually in collective sites, we already see that people with vulnerabilities live who cannot provide themselves with durable solutions in terms of housing, like older people, people with disabilities, low-income households, and so on. And we already see the signs of protracted displacement for people in collective sites, because usually the average duration of stay in collective sites is more than 3 months. In Since the escalation and conflict, we conduct our humanitarian situation monitoring. We have monthly settlement data on the situation and at settlements across all Ukraine and also in areas beyond the government of Ukraine control. The latest data from February 2023 shows us that the main issues in these areas are safety and security, access to cash and banking services, which is very important in terms of access to payments, pensions, social benefits, because people cannot practically move to control area to withdraw these payments in ATMs in Ukraine. Also, healthcare services and access to sufficient food were mentioned as the main issues in the areas beyond government control. As I said, we conduct the humanitarian situation monitoring since the escalation, and we analyze trends. And based on trends analysis, we see that areas and settlements far from the front line show some improvement, while the areas along the front line still have quite bad situation. One of the peculiar facets of the Ukraine's conflict is the 2022-2023 winter season, which was coupled with severe attacks on energy infrastructure, which impacted access to public utilities, particularly electricity, water supply, gas. And in November 2022, we released cold spot risk assessment, through which we wanted to identify the location and areas where people could have a higher risk of cold temperatures. You can see at this map in dark blue, like areas on the west where winter hazards, like cold waves, but also vulnerabilities, for example, like older people, people with in collective sites, and also damage to houses, which define the risk in terms of cold temperatures. We use this data to inform the response actors in terms of winterization activities, like provision of generators, like provision of NFI, and prioritization of areas. And we see that this data can be also potentially useful in 6 months period when the winterization activities will start for the next winter season. Yeah, one of the issue that is quite out of humanitarian portfolio usually is the incidents in military incidents in different like storage facilities, in damage to infrastructure, bridges, dams, and we do not have overall data about the damage to these areas, but we conduct area-based assessment based on spatial analysis, based on satellite imageries, and we see that these military incidents create and potentially could create humanitarian needs for people who live near these places. Yeah, this is one example that we did recently about flood near Irpin city after the damage to the bridge and dam. Many people be affected by flood, and many residential buildings with private agriculture areas were flooded or are at risk of being flooded. And I will finish my presentation with quite positive data about perception of humanitarian aid in Ukraine, which is based on the multi-sector needs assessment made in October-December. You can see that almost 1/3 of households in Ukraine reported that they received humanitarian aid since the escalation of conflict. Most of them, 82%, were satisfied with the aid that they received, but still there is mismatch between people who receive this aid and people who would like to receive humanitarian assistance. And yeah, maybe because it's about access or, yeah. So this is briefly about what's going on in Ukraine in 2022, based on the data. Yeah, and over to Gemma.
Thanks very much, Asya. Given the almost impossible task of summarizing the Ukraine situation in less than 15 minutes. So I think we can now switch over to the Zoom, where we'll have Derek hopefully waiting for us, and I think our panelists can now take a seat. I will just introduce them again. Now you can put faces to names. So again, Asya from Reach, Nuna from WFP, Liz from CEDA, and online Derek from FCDO. Great, there he is. All right, so loads of really, really interesting data points there that I'm sure we're going to get into in more detail. But I think I want to start this off by focusing less on the strategic level and more on the programmatic level. So maybe to kick us off, Nuna, a question to you. WFP in Ukraine and in many crises are in a very interesting position because you are both a data provider and also a programmatic intervener. So from your perspective, how has data been used in Ukraine to guide these kind of programmatic interventions?
Thank you, that is a very interesting question. So yes, absolutely. For those of you who don't know, in WFP we have a big in-house, if you will, analysis and assessment service, sometimes called VAM, sometimes called RAM. We can also just say assessments. That's what I work on. So I was reflecting a bit on this question on how we've actually been using the wealth of data that we have on Ukraine to guide the response since about a year ago. And I know this has probably been said in all the many sessions where Ukraine has come up. Ukraine is quite unique. Ukraine was also unique in the sense that we couldn't just take the 2021 plan and scratch out 2021 and put 2022 on it instead and then keep implementing, right? We came into a place where there was no large-scale humanitarian response prior to February of last year. In the case of WFP, that was even more so the case in the sense that we didn't even have a presence in the country before February of last year. So we kind of had to use evidence and data to understand what on earth we were going to do, right? Without any data to guide us, we wouldn't have had a response, basically. So the journey of that has been starting from basically understanding what is the kind of crisis that we're looking at, right? In the beginning, we were very focused on the displacement that we saw, getting those basic numbers just to inform us where are people, and what are the basic needs that they have, and how do we respond to that. And then more and more over the course of last year, being guided by sort of more solid assessments, more household level data. We've done a lot of remote assessments and then culminating with the large-scale MSNA assessment that we worked with Reach on. So that has been kind of the train of how it's been going last year, and more data to help guide the decision making. Sorry. So what does that actually really mean? Well, if you think back to one of the maps that we just saw, with a big assessment like an MSNA that has 13,000 household data points from all over the country, that really helps us guide where do we see the bigger needs, yeah? That's the first entry point. Do we respond across the country? Do we focus on particular parts of the country? Where are those needs that we're seeing? Where are they deeper? Where are they less deep? So that's the first part that helps us with the first layer of prioritization. That's giving us a bit what are we responding to? What does that look like across sectors? And what does it look like specifically on food security? That's the what, but we also need to, in WFP, specifically understand the how. So it cannot stand on its own. So what we also do is that we would go and do specific, almost like hotspot types of assessments. In Ukraine, we've been quite focused on understanding what are the market conditions and the humanitarian conditions in those areas that are close to the front line, the areas of Ukraine that are newly accessible, because we need to understand, we know there are people in need there, but how do we respond to them? We need to inform that response by understanding are markets actually functioning? Is agricultural activities still being carried out? What does that mean for the slightly longer term, for the here and now and for the longer term? So we bind all this together in order to come up with a proper response, yeah? Maybe the last thing to say is that, of course, there's also this sort of the back and forth on this. One thing is that we can set out to do a massive assessment, gives us the maps, it gives us the prioritization, that first layer, the understanding of where needs are. But in order to ask the right questions in that assessment, we also need to consistently talk to our implementing colleagues within WFP, but of course across the response, because that helps us ask the right questions in those assessments. We have indicators, we have standard ways of looking at things, but we also need to consistently make sure that we're asking the right questions when we go out. So having that kind of back and forth and that dual perspective on how we generate evidence and data is absolutely important.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I think I'll just go over to the donor perspective now as well, on essentially the same question. So maybe Liz, to you first. How have you used data to make donor decisions in relation to the Ukraine crisis specifically?
Yeah, sure. Well, broadly speaking, data analysis is absolutely central to our decision making at SIDA, whether it's in Ukraine or another humanitarian crisis. And for example, when it comes to prioritization, our aim is to prioritize fairly and impartially. And to be able to do that, of course, we need solid evidence as a basis for our decisions. Now, this aim is founded, first of all, on a recognition of the gap that we usually have between, and I say usually, we have between needs and resources. This is not new, of course. We've seen it for a long time. It's been growing exponentially in the last decade. So far, funding has been, let's say, abundant in Ukraine. But we have several major humanitarian crises competing for resources. Prioritization is a reality for all these crises, also in Ukraine. So our aim is that this prioritization should be done as fairly and impartially as possible, meaning people with the most severe needs being reached first with assistance, with humanitarian response. And ultimately, we see this as an accountability issue, accountability to the people we serve, the people in Ukraine, but also, of course, as donors to our taxpayers. So how do we do this then? Well, building on the Grand Bargain commitment to prioritize based on evidence, we do believe that evidence is central to this. And then the question becomes, well, what kind of evidence and how do we use that? And this is where data and analysis sources like the MSNA, like the HSM, and the analysis that's been shown here becomes interesting for us. I will take the MSNA as an example. So looking within Ukraine, it's, as Anastasia described, it's done across the whole country and in all parts. And I really want to stress the usefulness of having this kind of primary data collection exercise where everybody is asked, all those 13,000 something households are asked the same questions across all sectors. And so needs are identified in a comparable way across the whole crisis. And this particular feature of the MSNA gives us two essential pieces of information as users. Well, it gives us many pieces of information, but two that I want to highlight here in particular. It means, first of all, that the most severe needs are visible, the most severe situations are visible at a particular point in time across the crises, as identified by the MSNA in the east and the south of the country. And that is often much more challenging to identify with confidence if we use different types of sources that maybe cover different parts of the crises, maybe different population groups, maybe asking different questions, using different definitions. So that is one essential piece of information. The second piece of information that this feature really gives us is also what Anastasia was pointing to, this understanding of the co-occurrence of needs. Because everybody is asked the same questions of all the sectors, we can see exactly how the sectors overlap for people. What part of the population need our support in one sector or various combinations, and where they are. And this is a key strength of primary data collection exercises like these that are extremely useful for us. So how do we use this then? Well, with this information that the MSNA gives us about the variation of severity, the co-occurrence of needs, at SIDA we can then look at whether the response in Ukraine to those needs are going to be addressed by other humanitarian organizations or donors. And if they're not, then we can look at which of our partners are working in those areas and have the best capacity to respond to those particular needs and combination of needs that have been identified. And then we can direct our funding to those partners. I will pause there.
Thanks, Liz, for really accurately describing the best case scenario and what we all hope does happen. I think one really interesting thing about the Ukraine crisis, of course, is that we realized that that wasn't what happened last year because there was no data. Nuna mentioned, we did not have any foundation really upon which to base a new humanitarian plan. And of course, lots of the assumptions we were making about the humanitarian context turned out to be lesser or more true, depending on what happened. So perhaps I'll turn to Derek on the screen, or maybe I'll look over here and ask, are there any things that came out of the data that you're now seeing emerging from the humanitarian response in Ukraine that have been surprising to you? And perhaps surprising particularly because they don't necessarily match the assumptions that we made last year in this much more data scarce environment.
Thanks, Gemma, and thanks for putting this together. Really interesting discussion. And sorry I can't be with you. I'm still here in Kyiv, and nice to see so many old and former colleagues in the room. So, hello to everyone. There was in a sense, I think there's many things that are expected from data that we've been seeing, and just because there is such a large presence of our partners across the country. And that scale up that's happened last year has really helped not only donors be informed by the data, but be informed by people and organizations with an active presence. Having said that, I think there's a few things that have struck me coming from various sources of data. The first one is really around the frontline areas. This is an area I think it's when we all look back on this, one of the key questions would always be, how did people stay in these areas under such intense shelling, under such intense situation? And more recently, we started seeing reports, although not one comprehensive figure, but reports on some numbers that partners are using to go there, that the interagency convoys are using to go there. And we're seeing numbers of people living in these areas, let's say 0 to 30 kilometers from frontline areas, that are much larger than we thought. And this, I think, is something we really need to start thinking about, and is definitely put our mindset in a slightly different place in terms of how do we reach these people, not just with convoys, but how do we give the whole comprehensive, holistic version of humanitarian services in that area, and how do we strengthen what's already happening there? So I'd say that's the first one. The second one is really around the diversity of needs and how it really depends, on so many intersectional factors. What you need from us as a humanitarian sector if you're a Ukrainian. We have the severity according to population groups. So it was mentioned earlier, disabled, elderly, their ability to access the aid that we are delivering is something we really have to focus on. And that came out strongly in recent data sets. But also the location, as I mentioned, frontline areas, but around the country, the complexity or the complexion rather of needs is quite different. And that has a lot of implications for our interventions. The caseloads of people on the move versus someone that is displaced, or the interventions around collective centres has really been a strength of the response, I think, in terms of thinking through what type of humanitarian sector, what type of side of the humanitarian sector people need. I think that the last bit on that to say is really, it's about how we find them and how people that do fall through the gaps, how we make systems so that they can find the information they need, the sustained presence of actors that they need to get that information, and then of course have access to the aid they need, especially those with specific needs. Something that came out of a recent IOM displacement tracking matrix was that, and I see it as a little bit of an inflection point, was that there are now more returnees than IDPs. Now this figure might change again, but I think that was again something I thought was surprising recently, and something that makes us think about, okay, how do we think about this in terms of displaced people, returnees, and also, you know, some of those displaced people that might be in collective centres or in host communities, and that might be there for quite some time. And again, think through how that will affect our intervention. The last one I'd mention is just always surprising. It may be obvious, but it always surprises me. The scale of needs here is tremendous. The scale of needs, how diverse they are, and how widespread they are in such a large geographic place. All of what I've just said is probably quite obvious, but the being here, the work that goes into getting around the country, making sure that the appropriate services are around the country, linking to the other government systems, etc., is a gargantuan task. And so what the humanitarian system has achieved in the last year is very impressive in that regard. So maybe not surprising, but also surprising, that last one.
Great, thanks so much, Derek. And maybe, Nuna, the same question to you then, from the more programmatic perspective, about assumptions that have been challenged as a result of the data that we've been collecting and analysing for the last year.
Yeah, again, it's about this, for lack of a better word, journey that we've been through over the last 1 year, and trying to understand what kind of a crisis are we actually responding to. I think in some ways, I would say some assumptions have held up. We were already quite early on, a year ago, able to do rapid assessments using remote methods and getting an idea of the magnitude of the needs that were present across the country, looking at how that would overlap with displacement, non-displacement, and a lot of what we started seeing already quite early on with the flash appeals that were coming out early on in the crises actually kind of held fairly steady throughout the year, and now with much stronger evidence, we're still looking at quite the same level of magnitude. So I think that has been, yeah, in that sense, those assumptions, unfortunately, have held up. I very much agree with Derek in the populations that we're still seeing living very, very close to the very hot frontline areas, places that are newly accessible, places close to international borders and to frontline areas. It's been surprising going to these areas and seeing how many people are actually still residing there for like a wanting to displace or the ability to displace, and how we maintain a solid response to those populations. I think is going to be one of the main challenges going forward. That is surprising because we've all seen the media reports since a year ago about displacement, right? So the fact that we still have a lot of populations who've chosen or cannot displace, I think has been quite surprising. But yeah, I think other than that, I think it's been more kind of a gradient of increasing evidence building over the course of last year. And what we started seeing early on with early indications, with the evidence that REACH has been put together, IOM, WFP, etc., and it all has been sort of building up to the same, which is what we're seeing now, which is a crisis of massive needs, compounding needs the closer you get to the border, lack of basic services, lack of ability to move, those kinds of things really driving needs close to the front line, and then more so maybe, let's say, livelihood or economic drivers driving people to the brink of humanitarian need across the country. So you have this kind of dual picture of what is really driving needs, which then also leads, you know, us to how we need to respond to those needs. So we will probably continue to see a response that builds on two different feet, right? We have certain things that needs to be done close to frontline areas that look different from how we're responding in collective centers with IDPs in the middle of the country. We have people that have increasingly, we saw how economic factors like not having employment is really a significant driver of having compounding humanitarian needs. That is something we really need to look at. That holds true whether you live in a frontline area or not, right? And then you have these compounding things happening if you are living within that 0 to 30 kilometer boundary of the front line. So having those two sort of perspectives on what is driving needs and how we then continue to respond to them, I think is going to be one of the assumptions that we more and more are seeing also now backed up by the data, that we need to keep on revisiting and look at and understand how quickly can services recuperate in an area that becomes accessible again to the Ukrainian side. How quickly do populations want to actually move back or repopulate an area that has been less populated? What does that mean for restoration of basic services? What does that mean for the overall look on humanitarian needs in that area? Those are the kinds of things that we need to keep on revisiting. So I would say in terms of assumptions, it's been more kind of a gradient of building up the evidence, and then this, let's say, surprise that we still have a lot of people living under quite significant duress in areas very close to the front line.
Maybe just to come back to this point on frontline areas, I mean, I sat through a really interesting panel this morning from some participants from Acted and PIN in Ukraine talking about localization. And of course, this has been the big topic of conversation in the Ukraine crisis over the last year. Strong functioning civil society in conjunction with a government that is fully capable of responding to many of these needs. And when we see these needs in these frontline areas, these are also the areas which are most difficult to access by big international NGOs, also by the UN. So perhaps from the donor perspective, some of this operational data about where the most critical needs are and how difficult those people are to access by perhaps more traditional partners, what has this prompted in relation to thinking about localization? And maybe I'll hand over to Derek first, and then for Liz second.
Thanks, Emma. Yeah, a really important question on that. I think there's something we've been looking at, and it's in terms of firstly finding increasingly finding these numbers where we find more and more people in the frontline areas, and increasingly understanding that their situation is almost incomparable to many other areas of the country, and that I think that surprise that we were mentioning, or as another panelist put it, the increasing level of evidence that we have that there's more and more people there is interesting, and perhaps down to many people having been living underground. The fact there were many media reports of elderly disabled being left behind in certain cities, or small numbers like 4,000 when you hear about places like Bakhmut, but actually there are whole cities, and that vast territory actually holds so many more people. The way we've also been looking at access as well traditionally, and we often do this in many crises, can be sometimes getting stuff, to put it very crudely, from A to B, and a lot of that scale up has done that successfully when going to the front lines. The intensity of shelling, though, means that it is really hard for our partners to be there in a sustained way, which means that it's really hard if there's a child that needs specific services or is suffering from trauma or something else. How do we find them, and how do we refer them or give them the appropriate services? The local authorities are playing such an important role here, in terms of offloading a lot of cargo, being involved in the distribution. Then there's whole networks of local volunteer collectives of people that are already there, that are also instrumental to this part of the response. And again, just as mind-boggling it is about the people that stay there, stay behind, it's mind-boggling the work that they do to make sure that aid is distributed. What we don't have with these local volunteer collectives and local authorities is, or what we should see more of, is trying to support them in practical ways with PPE, safe houses for when they need to move from a distribution point because shelling comes in or danger increases, security protocols, fuel, logistical support, this kind of thing. We're looking at how we support them better to do what they're already doing. And then there's the there's the other side of humanitarian sector. So it's getting the stuff from A to B, but that child that has those specialist needs, or the elderly person that doesn't know where to go, or the disabled person that can't actually access the evacuation routes, etc. How do we get those local volunteer collectives and everyone that does have a sustained presence there to have the skills, have the capacity to link them to organisations that can support, or to identify those needs when on the ground. This is a really challenging area, and it's one we're applying more and more thought to. And some international NGOs with presence are also doing a tremendous job there in terms of transposing that capacity that the system does have centrally, but doesn't always have it at all levels. And so essentially, what we're looking at is, okay, how are things working there on the ground, and how can we support that? I don't think that's something that there is a magic bullet to. Or a silver bullet. I think that's just something we're going to have to incrementally chip away at, and most importantly, listen to those partners that are on the ground doing the work, and listen to what they think they need as well.
Thanks, Derek. Straight over to you, Liz, if you have a microphone.
Yes, thank you. I'll give a quick answer here as well, and I'll hook on to what Derek said there just at the end. We really rely on our partners for this, and I'll explain why that is. At CEDA, we generally practice and advocate for flexible funding, unearmarked funding, not only in Ukraine, but everywhere. In Ukraine, for example, all our support is flexible to some extent, and we believe our partners are more effective in the work that they do that way. At the same time, as I mentioned before, we want our funding to be used to reach those with the most severe needs first. And that means, and this goes back to your previous question as well, Gemma, in terms of how data is used for donor decisions. Well, for us, it's equally, if not more important, for the reason I just explained, how our partners use this kind of evidence for their decisions. We completely rely on them, we completely put our trust in them to use evidence like this to inform their own strategic planning and prioritization, their own engagement strategies.
Wonderful, thank you. The last area I want to talk about, and then we'll open up for questions from the floor more broadly, is lessons learned. So obviously, I think those of us who've been working in Ukraine over the last year do feel that it was somewhat, it's a unique crisis and perhaps unprecedented. And we, of course, hope that something like this will never happen again, but we are also cognizant of the realities of the modern world. And so there are certainly some things that we want to take away from this experience. And particularly on the data portion, I think there's a lot of lessons that we learned in relation to scaling up in a crisis where you don't have access, you don't have any information, and decisions have got to be made very quickly that relate to very large pots of funding. So perhaps first we'll talk on the data side, and I'll just ask Asya and then Nuna for a couple of comments, if you have them, on what lessons you think we've learned from a data perspective in engaging in a crisis of this scale when we have such limited access to populations on the ground.
Well, I think which is quite important is to monitor the situation regularly. We started with very rapid assessments, very simple assessments after the escalation of the conflict, and we managed to scale them up and kept on track the key indicators that are important for different sectors. And that's why we are able to make this presentation today about the 1 year crisis in Ukraine. So I think, this is maybe the main lessons learned. Also, in terms of the territories to which we don't have access, like most of humanitarians don't have access to the areas that were occupied by Russia. We in Reach also don't have access to these areas to go and conduct interviews and collect the data about the needs of people in these areas. But we do use so-called area of knowledge approach when we collect information from people who recently returned, arrived from this area. Of course, this approach is biased. Sometimes, yeah, it's subjective, but still, this is a quite important information and quite important source how we could get this information from this inaccessible area.
Thanks, Asia. Yeah, I definitely think that's a really critical point, right? To some extent, recognizing that you're going to have to drop something, and it's either going to be the timeliness, or it's going to be the methodology, or something. But something has to go in the early stages of a crisis, and in some cases, you may choose to go for timeliness over the kind of normal methodological rigor you might want to apply if you had full access and full time.
Yeah, I very much agree with that. And sometimes I think, at least my own kind of takeaway from the very early days, like more than a year ago, was that sometimes it's the simplest data that actually makes the biggest impact. Like, I think as data people, we sometimes come from the idea that we need to roll out an assessment, we need to have a methodology, and we need to sample households, and then we need to ask them all these questions, and then we need to make an analysis, and then we can make a decision. And that certainly wasn't how things were going to go on the 25th of February last year, right? I think some of the things that I spent the first weeks on mostly was basically just basic stuff like population data. Where are people moving to? Where are they? Where are they going from? Where are they going to? Using social media, using news reports, using people we could call local authorities, as Derek mentioned, has been a massive source of information. And I think being a little bit pragmatic in those early stages, listening very carefully to what are, my own implementation colleagues actually asking for, rather than thinking that I need to go out and ask all the standard assessment questions. That I need to prepare, of course, as I do all these other things, but at least in the very, very early stages, just having that kind of very simplistic understanding actually made the biggest impact. And then I think the other thing that has been, from my perspective, incredibly helpful is that we have, I think, collectively as humanitarian data providers, made a lot of strides in the last 10 years in terms of remote methods and in terms of standardized methods. And that meant that when I started working on the response on the 6th of March last year, we were already rolling a couple of remote assessments inside Ukraine using phone surveys, using web surveys with our standard indicators. And then, of course, you can go into a discussion of, is this exactly how we should ask this question in this context, and should we maybe, you can always improve on things, but the fact that there was something that I could basically almost as easy as pressing a button, and then we can start rolling some sort of evidence generation, because we had done the advanced thinking in our organizations for the past many years on how to do it, and because we were in an environment that allowed us to use that kind of technology, meant that pretty quickly we got some first idea of what that map looked like. That started already very early on giving us an idea that, yeah, we need to look at displaced people, yeah, we need to look at the east and the south. So even that piece of information, however simple it seems, was very, very powerful to be able to get very, very early on. So I think that's another lesson, that if you have standard methods, it doesn't mean that standard methods will always get you all the way in all contexts, but it does mean that you can move really, really fast when you need to. So I think that was another key takeaway that I'll definitely bring with me. And then I think the last thing was also what you mentioned around finding creative ways to access populations that we can't access. This was a problem from the start. It still is a big problem that there are populations that we simply cannot call them because there is no network. We cannot interview them because we do not have access. But we can talk to people who might be in touch with them one way or the other. We can talk to people who have displaced from these places and still get some sort of an idea. And I think exploring those kinds of methodologies, I think, is going to be another thing to really take away. So yeah, those are a few things among the many, many things that I think we'll have to write a book about at some point.
Yeah, if anyone's interested to read a book about all the mistakes that were made over the last year, we'll be publishing soon. Maybe, Derek, over to you just to provide a donor perspective on that as well then. So I think one of the things that's really interesting about the linkages between data and action in the humanitarian system is, of course, the funding cycles, right? We know when the funding cycles are happening. They happen on usually quite set time frames. So in Ukraine particularly, the context was changing so quickly that the data was changing all the time. The information that we were providing was changing at the time. I mean, perhaps some reflections from you on what was useful and what wasn't in relation to then trying to make decisions about where the money should go in this incredibly complex year that we've had in Ukraine.
Great question. So I would agree with what you said there in the there are set times for funding decisions, but also there are many throughout the year. So while our processes can be quite slow and set to influence using needs data when it's sort of presented appropriately and the right discussion. Thing that would be useful is to have as often as possible needs updates of what are the key changes, what are the assumptions we need to revise, etc. So very much was in lots of agreement with what was being said before, but sometimes it's not possible to do the most in-depth needs assessment so many times throughout the year. But doing top level analysis or doing specific analysis on themes or areas or sectors or just very top level updating of what we know is really useful because it will no doubt come in time for 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 donors next tranche because they are spaced throughout the year. In terms of how we use it and how we can be helped to use it, I think we have this inherent tension between flexible funding and ensuring that the totality of aid is proportionate to the severity of need and that the overall aid package that we collectively are funding as donors is reaching the most severe in the quantities that it should, bearing in mind the enormous challenge of access. And so some of that is within the needs data, but some of that is also within response and gaps. So something we do as donors is have a look at what we're funding, and we do that, try to do that sort of coordination in terms of what partners, what sectors are being funded to what level, and where might the gaps be. Getting too much into the detail down that road might not work. So we do try to keep it top level and then allow that flexibility to our partners. I'd say the last thing in terms of what could we see going forward is possibly some more discussions between those collecting the data and the donors to help us interpret it. There's so many intricacies of what the data says and what it means, and so many nuances around that I think it would be a really useful exercise to have those conversations. What are the priorities? So if 2 things have a severity level of 4, and one of them is livelihoods and one of them is health, does that mean they're the same priority? What do people understand when they say what their priority is on the ground? If a respondent says X sector is the priority, is that because that's the first thing they need? Is it because that's going to be the most life-saving intervention? Or is it because that's what they understand that the humanitarian sector will deliver? And so they maybe haven't thought of some protection services or those sorts of things. So there's a ton of these types of intricacies, I think, in the way the data is collected that would be helpful for us donors to understand in terms of how it's presented. And there isn't always a right or wrong answer, but just to understand those nuances around that. And I could go into many more examples, but won't on those small things. And then lastly, to say, I mean, going forward, I think also just to think about what do we do with the needs information we have on non-government controlled areas. It's a tremendous methodology. It's a tremendous enterprise that's gone into collecting that data. And it's really important on many, many levels for the small scale response that is there, but for moreover also in terms of advocacy. And so I think that's a really important question I'll just leave hanging in terms of what's the appropriate use of that and what's the right approach for us to collectively use that. And I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We have about 10 minutes left, I think, something approaching this. So we'll now open it up for questions from the room. We don't have Slido in here, so you'll just have to stick your hand up. and then we'll get a mic to you. So, yeah, and then...
Hi, Philippe in Habitat. Thanks a lot for the presentations. 2 questions. One, to what extent are you able to kind of geolocate and break down the data to that local level? Because you're showing oblast level, but the importance of kind of differentiating between cities and rural, and even within cities, because sometimes it's neighborhoods. And so to what extent is the data allowing you a more area-based approach to response? Specifically because sometimes exactly, it's not just about, to Derek's point, which sector to prioritize, but understanding action on one sector, for instance, livelihoods, can help a lot with other sectors. Shelter, of course, is the obvious example, but even access to markets and health, food security. So that's the first question. And to your, I mean, you stressed the what is important to get to the how, and the how in itself requires kind of rethinking some of the data. I would assume in Ukraine it's really important, and I think it came up last year in the Lugano conference, to focus on recovery whenever and wherever possible. Specifically exactly because we do see a population that is really keen to return or to stay. So the answer to the how is sometimes maybe not just responding with assistance, but actually trying to figure out how to restore markets or how to restore livelihoods. Those 2 questions.
Thank you. I think we'll just take a couple more, and then, so I think we have one down here.
Just very basic. Derek, how do we get in touch with you?
Great. We'll put that on the list to answer.
Okay.
Anyone else? I think we've probably got space for another. No, great. So perhaps we can, yeah.
Or maybe one very naive question, because you mentioned the difficulty to get data in areas not accessible. Okay, but once you have this data, is anyone doing anything with those data? Because this is difficult to actually inform the programming and responses since we cannot access. So what is the use?
Thank you. Really important question. We'll take Felipe's questions first. So perhaps, Asia, do you want to answer on the area-based / sort of geographic widespreadness of data first?
Yeah. Well, some of our like rapidness assessment are very like generic assessment, which do not allow us to make this disaggregation. But for example, MSNA data that was presented, it can be disaggregated by rayon level. It's admin 2. It's more detailed than oblast level. The sample was built to have this representative data on rayon 2 level. We also do area-based assessments in different localities. For example, we did area-based assessment in Lvivska Oblast, in Dnipropetrovska Oblast, and the data is representative for different populations groups, like displaced, non-displaced population, and also population who live in collective sites. Yeah.
Perfect. Yep. Nuna?
So that's a nice segue to ask about, like, how do we actually then use this data at this granular level? So you're absolutely right. Like, recovery needs to be thought in right from the start. It is being thought in from the start in the response. If I can give some examples, like the ones I know best from WFP, one of the main choices we always have to make when we respond to humanitarian needs is whether we respond with cash or with in-kind food, basically, as seemingly simple as that. And by this, we're guided by the granular understanding of how does markets function and how quickly do they recover. If at all we can, we would want to give people cash because it does have a humanitarian response element. It also has a recovery element. In places where we're seeing that markets are about to recover but aren't actually fully recovered, or very much where we see that businesses would need an incentive to reopen, we see that a lot around Chersonska in the south. We're providing people with vouchers to supermarkets that allow supermarket chains to reopen. So that's somehow a recovery element. Then one thing we did not speak at all about here, we were focused very much on the sort of household side of humanitarian needs, but there's lots and lots of assessment and thinking and work going into the agricultural recovery side of the thing, of the response at the moment, which has both an immediate intervention angle, but also very much a what comes next angle. One of the main focuses this year of WFP and of many others is going to be around demining in Ukraine. I don't need to tell you all that Ukraine is a massive agricultural producer, and that has obviously suffered a lot in the production areas, because that is where a lot of the war has been very, very warm and continues to be. And that is something that is really harming the longer term perspectives. So that is something that is happening alongside the very, let's say, humanitarian classic interventions that's happening, especially around frontline areas. Those things are also being thought in. And then the last bit that may be really worth mentioning, we're looking at the largest cash response in the world. A lot of that cash is running through government systems or concurrent with government systems alongside building up those systems, which is also a recovery. What comes next? How do we actually leave this country a better place than we found it, hopefully, in not that long? So all of those things are there. We spoke more about this sort of very typical humanitarian needs right now, but all of that is happening alongside of it.
Thanks. And then, Derek, just over to you for just a couple of minutes. Firstly, on how people should get in touch with you. And secondly, how you're using the data that's being collected from these inaccessible areas as a donor.
Thanks. So on the first one, I don't know who the we is that wants to get in touch with it, so I should probably check that first and then go through you, Gemma. No, only kidding. Yeah, please be in touch through Gemma, and we can touch base. In terms of how we're using that data from inaccessible areas, I think, so we actually are, part of a couple of donor groups. In those donor groups, we do regularly, systematically check on people's funding pipelines, discuss some of the priorities for that funding. So the first one would be, making sure that we're all understanding the needs in the same way, and ensuring that we're coordinating that piece. Secondly, we discuss with our partners. So the partners that we do fund have that conversation around how it's going for them in terms of their access and presence in areas that it's difficult to reach, and what the situation is for those areas that they cannot reach. And then when we're deciding a portfolio, I think it's partnerships and relationships, I think it's really important that we think about the comparative advantage of all of those partners within the piece that we fund, or the piece that donors collectively fund. And we're looking at partners that reach in inaccessible area A, inaccessible area B, and that have different modalities, different areas, geographic areas, as well as sectoral areas of focus, so that all of those modalities are continued. I have to say, in the non-government controlled areas, it's really, really challenging. So it's not a simple story, but incentivizing and strengthening what we can in those areas, and like I was saying earlier, strengthening what we can through the actors that are there with a presence in the frontline areas is really important to us.
Thanks very much, Derek. Just in closing, I think we're a little bit over, but if you just grant me 2 more minutes, I'd like to hand over to Liz, because what we've talked about a lot here today is what we're currently able to do, and what we have managed to do over the last year in Ukraine, which is absolutely fantastic. But I think we want to close on a section that I've optimistically called Hopes for the Future, about the ability to use data to compare not just within a crisis, but also between crises. So Liz, over to you.
Thank you, Gemma. Yes, so like Gemma said, if we zoom out here towards the end of our conversation, this very interesting conversation, so thank you very much for organizing this. Because ultimately all crises are more or less interconnected. We've seen that particularly in the last year. Use of evidence is, of course, just as important when we look across humanitarian crises globally. And it's also immensely challenging both to produce and use this kind of evidence. Now, our hope for the future is that data like this will help solve some of these issues. So no pressure, but yeah, that's the expectation. And I'll explain why we think this is possible. We really do think this could be within reach. So from a donor perspective, from CEDA's perspective, I should say, just like we do in Ukraine to practice fair and impartial prioritization, we try to do the same at a global level. We try to understand where people are with the most severe needs when we look across all crises. And we try to understand what kind of funding is needed to address those needs. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to get this understanding today for several reasons, but underpinning them all is a lack of visibility, essentially. And this is going back to the question that was just asked, that Derek elaborated an answer on. But visibility is key. We have to never give up trying to reach people in areas that are hard to reach. And the problem here that we're facing is that severity is identified very differently across crises, the severity of needs. And this means that we have the severest needs hidden in a wider group. We don't know where they are when we look across all crises globally. And we have some analysis initiatives like the GF, that some of you may be familiar with, which is aiming to provide some kind of comparability at an analysis level. And the IPC, of course, for food. And this is very promising. But there are, of course, massive technical challenges inherent in trying to produce this across on a global level, both in terms of defining severity, never mind measuring them. Nevertheless, we have to prioritize, to link back to where we were at the beginning of the session. We can't escape that, and having at least some comparable primary data, like the MSNA, for example, could help prevent people with the most severe needs being hidden away in this sort of wider group. Now, I know the team behind the MSNA are very cautious about making cross-crises analysis, and rightly so. The technical challenges are immense, but and it's reassuring, frankly, that they're taken so seriously. But if we at CEDA had a hope for the future, it would be that the possibility of producing this kind of analysis is seriously considered, a sort of cross-crisis comparison, using only using the indicators, of course, where you have the best alignment, the good enough alignment. Because the reality is that cross-crisis comparisons are happening all the time. We do them, and we do it based on sources that are frankly not comparable. We compare based on the evidence we have, and we try to adjust ourselves based on how we think they differ. And I dare to say that kind of comparison will be much safer, more accurate, more objective if it was done by the MSNA analysis process than by us donors laboring away with our Excel matrices. Or maybe that's just CEDA, but we use Excel matrices for this. So yes, so that's our wish for the future, that we have some kind of cross-crisis analysis coming out of this great work that you're doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Liz. And on that very optimistic note, we can wrap up and let everyone go to lunch. So thank you very much for attending. Thank you very much to all the panelists, and I hope you have a really pleasant afternoon.